IAM for security. IAM Users and Roles. In this video, we will look at the definition of IAM users and roles. We will look at how users and roles are built from policies, and we will look at the use cases for users versus the use cases for roles. IAM users are authenticated individuals who are authorized to access AWS services and resources. Authentication is handled by static credentials for programmatic access and optionally multi-factor for access using the console. In my personal case, I use my username, password, and a token when I access the AWS console. Authorization for users is granted based off a collection of groups and policies. This diagram shows the relationships between users, groups, and policies. In this example, you can see user 1's authorization is based off two groups. In turn, those two groups are authorized based off three separate policies. In other words, user 1 is authorized based off three policies. You can also see user 2, who is authorized based off one group and one policy. It turns out that group is shared between user 2 and user 1, and that group only has one policy associated with it. Therefore, we can say that user 2's authorization is based off two policies. If you recall, in the last demo, we created two users. Each user was associated with one group, and each group was associated with three policies. The key point is that user authorization is based off some arbitrary combination of groups and policies. IAM roles are used to define which AWS services and resources a trusted entity can access. We'll talk a little bit more about trust in a moment. Trusted entities are given a short-term token which is associated with the role. These tokens can be renewed if necessary. Roles are built out of policies. Again, these policies can be shared with other roles, users, and groups. This diagram shows the relationship between roles and policies. As you can see, role 1 is based off two policies. Role 2 is based off four policies. One of those policies is shared between role 1 and role 2. Now let's talk about how an entity can establish trust and use that trust to assume a role. There are three common methods for an entity to establish trust. The first example is a caller who presents an AWS Security Token Service, or STS, token. The STS token is associated with a role, and by possessing the token, it's assumed that that entity can assume that role. The second example is an AWS service. For example, if an EC2 instance is created with a particular IAM role, that EC2 instance can then assume that role. The third example is a federated user. A federated user is someone who has been authenticated by an external system which is trusted. In all three examples, the caller has established trust, and therefore no credentials are associated with the role. This is a key difference between a user and a role. A user has credentials, a role does not. Let's also spend another moment to talk about STS tokens. As I just mentioned, a caller presenting an STS token is allowed to assume that role. Even though an STS token has a maximum life of 1 hour, you should treat an STS token just as carefully as you would treat a static credential. Now let's spend a minute to talk a little bit more about STS tokens. As I mentioned a moment ago, anyone who possesses the token is authorized to access AWS resources and services. Even though an STS token has a maximum life of 1 hour, you should treat STS tokens as if they were a static credential, because for that period of time, anyone possessing that token can access your resources.